In April 2025, scientists extracted DNA from 2 women buried in the Sahara Desert 7,000 years ago. What they found inside those bones had never been seen before in any human population on Earth, a true discovery. The lineage was not sub-Saharan African. It was not Near Eastern. It was not connected to any population scientists had ever cataloged. It was something entirely separate. A human group had been living in isolation in North Africa for 50,000 years, leaving almost no trace in the modern genetic record, and it had never appeared in any scientific literature until that moment. Every assumption scientists held about who populated the ancient Sahara, where they came from, and how they lived was wrong. The implications for African history, for who North Africans really are, where Black civilization began, and how deep the human story on this continent actually runs are still being worked out. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. In the early 2000s, archaeologists working in the Tadjart Akakas Mountains of southwestern Libya stumbled onto a rock shelter tucked into the ancient stone cliffs. Inside it, they found something that should not have been possible in one of the driest places on the planet: pottery shards, bone tools, remnants of woven baskets, the carefully arranged graves of 15 women and children, buried with intention and care, paintings on the cave walls depicting giraffes, hippopotamuses, cattle, and scenes of human life, of hunting, herding, and community, in a landscape that today supports almost none of those things. The site was called Takarkori, and the people buried inside it had been living in a world that no longer exists, a world where the Sahara was green. Scientists had long known that the Sahara was not always a desert. Geological evidence, fossilized pollen samples, ancient lake deposits, and decades of archaeological finds had established that for a period roughly between 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, a stretch of time scientists call the African Humid Period, or informally the Green Sahara, the entire region was transformed into a lush, wet savanna. Lakes and rivers stretched across what is now bare sand. Forests covered regions that are today completely barren. The region that is now the world's most hostile desert had permanent wetlands, navigable waterways, and grasslands that stretched to the horizon. Elephants, crocodiles, hippos, and giraffes moved through a landscape alive with grasses and water. Fish were caught in rivers that no longer exist. Wild cattle were hunted across plains that are now dunes. The climate of the African Humid Period, driven by shifts in the Earth's orbit and increased monsoon rainfall, transformed North Africa into one of the most habitable regions on the planet, and human beings were there, building communities, developing sophisticated material culture, learning to herd domesticated animals, painting rock shelter walls with vivid scenes of the world around them, and burying their dead with deliberate care. But who were those people really? Where did they come from? Were they connected to the population south of the Sahara, the ancestors of sub-Saharan Africa, or to the peoples of the Mediterranean and the Near East? For decades, scientists could only guess, because DNA, fragile and heat-sensitive and dependent on environment, almost never survived in Saharan conditions. Every attempt to extract genetic information from the region's ancient bones had either failed entirely or produced incomplete results. Until April 2025. In April 2025, a team of researchers led by scientist Nada Salam at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, one of the world's foremost institutions for ancient DNA research, published a study in Nature that changed everything scientists thought they knew about who the ancient Saharan people were. The team had spent years working with 2 of the best preserved individuals from Takarkori, 2 women estimated to have died around 7,000 years ago, whose remains had been naturally mummified by the extreme aridity of the desert environment. Their skin, ligaments, and soft tissues were still partially intact. Using techniques refined specifically for extracting ancient DNA from environments where preservation is poor, the researchers managed to recover full, whole genome sequences from both individuals, tooth and bone samples that yielded enough genetic material to reconstruct complete ancestral profiles. These were the first full ancient genomes ever recovered from the Central Sahara. And the results were not what anyone expected. Before this study, scientists had two leading hypotheses about who the Green Sahara's inhabitants were. The first hypothesis was that the people of the Green Sahara were an extension of sub-Saharan African populations, that when the rains came and the desert greened, people from further south moved north through the now hospitable landscape and occupied the newly fertile region. This made intuitive sense. The Green Sahara would have functioned as a corridor, connecting North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa in ways that the desert today does not allow. The second hypothesis was that the Green Sahara's pastoral communities, the people who were herding cattle and goats across the savannah, had migrated in from the Near East, where agriculture and animal domestication first developed. This also seemed plausible. The spread of farming across North Africa and the Mediterranean world had involved the movement of people in many other regions. Both hypotheses were wrong. When the Takarkori genomes were compared against the genetic profiles of populations from across the African continent and the wider world, the researchers found something that matched neither theory. The two women carried a genetic signature that had never been documented before. 93% of their ancestry came from a previously unknown North African lineage, a population that geneticists had simply never seen. A lineage that was not sub-Saharan African, not Levantine, not European, not connected to any of the populations that scientists had assumed might explain the Green Sahara's people. This lineage was something else entirely, something ancient, something isolated, something that had been hiding in the heart of what is now the world's largest desert for tens of thousands of years, leaving almost no trace in the modern genetic record, and which had never been described in any scientific literature until now. To understand just how ancient this lineage is, you need to understand the timeline. Roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, a group of modern humans left Africa and began spreading across Eurasia, eventually reaching every inhabited corner of the planet. This is the event geneticists call the out-of-Africa dispersal. The lineages of every non-African person alive today trace back to that migration. The Takarkori lineage split from sub-Saharan African populations at approximately the same time as that dispersal, 50,000 years ago. Instead of moving out into Eurasia, this ancestral population appears to have stayed in North Africa and then stayed isolated there, separate from both the sub-Saharan populations to the south and the Eurasian populations to the north for most of the tens of thousands of years that followed. Think about what isolation for 50,000 years means. While humans were crossing into Europe, reaching Australia, pushing into Central Asia, navigating the islands of the Pacific, and crossing into the Americas, this population in North Africa remained genetically distinct, genetically separate, accumulating its own unique mutations, developing its own unique biology, adapting to its own environment in its own way. It built its own culture, developed its own technologies, painted its own images on stone walls, and lived its own story that no other human population shared or even knew about. When the rest of the world was diversifying, expanding, and mixing, this population stayed where it was. And for 50,000 years, the genetic record held, essentially unchanged, essentially alone. The Max Planck team confirmed the genetic trail of this isolation with remarkable specificity. The two Takarkori women had approximately 0.15% Neanderthal DNA. This number is striking because of where it sits. People outside Africa typically carry between 0.6 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, the result of ancient interbreeding between early modern humans and Neanderthals during the out-of-Africa dispersal. People in sub-Saharan Africa today carry essentially no Neanderthal DNA because their ancestors were never part of that interbreeding event. The Takarkori women sit in between, carrying more Neanderthal ancestry than modern sub-Saharan Africans. but 10 times less than Levantine farmers of the same period. This unusual position is genetic evidence of a population that was not fully inside Africa's genetic world, but was not fully outside it either. A population that had received trace amounts of outside genetic material, probably through limited contact with groups to the north or east, without ever being replaced or absorbed by them. The connection to Takarkori cave in Morocco deepened the story further. 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, long before the Green Sahara existed, a group of people was living in eastern Morocco, sheltering in a cave called Takarkori. Their remains had been excavated and their DNA sequenced in earlier research. They were associated with a sophisticated stone tool industry called the Ibra Maroujan, and their genetics had always seemed puzzling, carrying a mixture of North African and some Levantine ancestry that did not fit neatly into any clean narrative. The Takarkori women shared their closest genetic connection with these 15,000-year-old Takarkori cave dwellers, not with any modern population, not with sub-Saharan Africans, not with Egyptians or Nile Valley communities, with Ice Age hunter-gatherers in Morocco who lived 8,000 years before them. This finding suggests something profound. The ancient North African population, the lineage carried by the Takarkori women, had been present and stable across the entire northern tier of Africa for at least 15,000 years before the Green Sahara even began. This was not a population that moved into the Sahara when it greened. This was not an opportunistic migration of people who saw a newly hospitable landscape and moved into it from somewhere else. This was a population that had already been there in the wider North African region for millennia, surviving ice ages, climate shifts, and the repeated transformations of a continental environment, and simply continued to be there when the rains came and the landscape transformed around them. Deep roots, unbroken continuity, a human story told across 15,000 years in the same stretch of North African rock and soil without anyone arriving from outside to change it. Now here's the revelation that most directly rewrites what we thought we knew about this era of African history, and it involves something that on the surface seems completely unrelated to genetics. Around 8,300 years ago, the people of the Green Sahara began herding domesticated cattle and goats. The rock art at Takarkori and dozens of other Saharan sites depicts these animals in vivid detail, moving in herds, tended by human figures, in scenes that suggest pastoralism was a central, organized feature of life across the Green Sahara by the time these women were alive. Where did that knowledge come from? How did people who had been genetically isolated for tens of thousands of years suddenly start herding domesticated animals? Animals that were first domesticated in the Near East and then in parts of Africa, but not, as far as anyone knew, originally in the Central Sahara. Scientists had long assumed the answer was migration. When a new technology or subsistence strategy appears in the archaeological record of a population, the most common explanation is that new people arrived, people who already knew how to do it, who brought the knowledge with them as they moved. This is what happened across Europe when farming arrived. New people came in from Anatolia, and they brought domesticated wheat, sheep, and goats with them. The genetics of Europe changed dramatically. The Takarkori DNA showed that nothing like this happened in the Green Sahara. The genetics of the two women, despite living in a community that clearly herded cattle, showed no significant influx of Near Eastern ancestry, no wave of new populations, no detectable genetic replacement or mixing with Levantine farmers or Nile Valley agriculturalists. The people remained the same isolated North African lineage they had always been, but they adopted the new technology anyway. The study's senior author, Savino Di Lernia of Sapienza University in Rome, who has spent his career excavating Saharan sites, put it plainly: the Green Sahara was not a corridor for the movement of people, but it was absolutely a corridor for the movement of ideas. Pastoralism transformed life across the Sahara, and it spread through cultural diffusion, through contact, exchange, and the adoption of new practices by populations who remain genetically unchanged. People talked to each other, they traded, they shared knowledge across vast distances, and they transformed their way of life without genetically becoming different people. This finding matters far beyond the Sahara. It is a direct challenge to one of the most common assumptions in ancient history, the idea that when a new technology or cultural practice appears in the archaeological record, it necessarily means new people arrived and brought it with them. Archaeologists call this demic diffusion, the spread of culture through population movement. For decades, it has been the default explanation for major transitions in the human story. The Takarkori evidence demands a more nuanced view. Sometimes culture travels faster than people. Sometimes populations absorb transformative new ideas from neighbors, from trade contacts, from chance encounters across a landscape, and become culturally different without becoming genetically different. The Green Sahara pastoralists learned to herd animals. They changed how they fed themselves and organized their communities. They did it without being replaced. They did it because they were connected to the wider world through ideas, even when they were not connected to it through DNA. Perhaps the most surprising result of all was what the DNA did not show. For decades, a leading hypothesis in African prehistory held that the Green Sahara, precisely because it was green, precisely because it was hospitable, precisely because it connected regions that the desert normally separates, must have served as a genetic highway between North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. The idea was intuitive. A Green Sahara would have allowed sub-Saharan populations to move north, and North African populations to interact with sub-Saharan ones in ways that the modern desert does not permit. And if that was true, it would have had enormous implications for understanding the genetic history of the entire African continent. The Takarkori genome showed this did not happen, not detectably, not in any significant way. The two women carried no detectable sub-Saharan African ancestry, none. The researchers ran every available statistical test for genetic exchange between the Takarkori lineage and sub-Saharan populations, and found nothing. Johannes Krauss, director of the archaeogenetics department at the Max Planck Institute and one of the study's senior authors, said it directly. Despite the Sahara's transformation into a lush, habitable landscape, gene flow between sub-Saharan and North African groups remained minimal during the African humid period. The Green Sahara was green. It was full of life. It was home to giraffes and hippos and human communities that built culture, herded animals, and painted on cave walls. And the people who lived in it stayed genetically who they were, isolated from the populations both south and north of them, while the world's largest genetic barrier held, even when it did not look like a barrier at all. What does this all mean for the broader story of African history, and particularly for the history of North Africa? It means that the modern populations of North Africa, the Berber and Amazigh peoples of Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, the communities of the Sahel and the Deep Sahara, carry within their genomes an ancestral contribution from a lineage that is tens of thousands of years old, that existed in North Africa long before any of the more recent migrations that historical records describe, and that was genetically distinct from every other human population on Earth. This lineage no longer exists in its pure, unmixed form. The North Africa of today is the product of thousands of years of subsequent migrations, farming peoples from the Near East, Arabic-speaking populations from the expansion of Islam, Bantu-speaking communities from further south, Mediterranean traders, conquerors, and settlers. All of those movements left genetic marks, but beneath all of them, still detectable in the DNA of modern North Africans, is a layer of ancestry that traces back to the Takarkori women, to the people of the Green Sahara, to a lineage that was already ancient when the pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. The Sahara is often described as a barrier between Africa's north and its south, between the Mediterranean world and what colonial-era Europeans call sub-Saharan Africa. That framing has shaped how people understand African history, African identity, and African civilization for centuries. It has been used to artificially separate North Africa from the rest of the continent, to treat the Maghreb, Libya, and Egypt as somehow peripheral to the African story or as extensions of a Mediterranean or Middle Eastern world rather than expressions of an African one. It has fed narratives that deny the Africanness of ancient North African civilizations and the people who built them, and it rests on a flawed premise that the Sahara has always been what it is today, and that what lies north of it has always been separate from what lies south. The bones beneath the Sahara tell a different story, not a story of barriers and separations, but of a deep, ancient, continuous human presence that stretches back 50,000 years into the African past, a lineage that survived ice ages, that watched the desert green and brown again, that adopted new technologies without losing its identity, and that left its genetic mark on every modern North African person alive today. The Sahara did not erase that story. It preserved it in rock shelters and ancient bone, in the teeth of two women who herded cattle on a green savanna 7,000 years ago, in the DNA of every modern North African who carries, without knowing it, the faintest genetic echo of a people who watched the world's largest desert bloom and stayed, a people who were there before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before every civilization that history chose to remember. And now the DNA is finally beginning to name them. If this video changed how you see African history, click subscribe. The bones always know more than the history books admitted.